Well, I think that the economic crisis starting in 2008 demonstrated that the scientific foundations of mainstream economics is extremely weak. We didn't even have the basic tools within the mainstream of the profession to even observe what was going on at that moment, which was the buildup of this massive financial bubble, and to understand its ramifications. Now, there were people that did understand it, and those were the heterodox economists, and you've had major people within the heterodox tradition who not only have recognized the problem of systemic financial instability, but have been proposing things about how to deal with it. I mean, the first name that comes to mind is Hyman Minsky, who is this great figure of the previous 40 years who's been explaining the systemic problems of capitalism within the financial system. So that's, one branch of heterodox economics that has done very well. Similarly, I would say, one of the arguments, mainstream arguments with respect to unemployment, is that unemployment is due to what we call labor market rigidities. That's a euphemism to say social protections that help ordinary people. And the mainstream economics has said you need to get rid of those because they cost too much, and that's driving up the cost of hiring workers, and so you need to get rid of that. But again, the evidence, there is never any foundation in evidence, and the heterodox economists have been demonstrating that now for at least a decade or two. So I think the mainstream of the profession of our science has been very weak, although, as you said, the heterodox alternatives certainly need more work and development, but really have been asking the right questions and have been coming up with good answers now for at least a generation. Well, the neoliberal agenda really started in the 1970s. I mean, coming out of World War II, essentially within capitalist countries, you had a predominant social democratic Keynesian framework that was undergirded by the works of John Maynard Keynes and people subsequent to John Maynard Keynes, which synthesized the idea of a welfare state with managing aggregate demand on behalf of full employment. That was the basic model, with variations. The neoliberal agenda turns the whole thing on its head and says the only way that you get to a full employment economy is through labor market flexibility, getting rid of social protections and forcing people to have lower wages, and deregulation. So we deregulated financial markets, which of course led to the financial crisis. So I would say the neoliberal agenda, which has been predominant since the late, so 35 years now, caused the financial crisis and then had no solution. So my initial thought in 2008 was that people would see the failings of neoliberalism and we would start to see serious alternatives. I think we've seen some of that. At the same time, though, as you mentioned, we've seen consolidation of neoliberalism in the form of austerity programs. Because austerity programs are simply the variant of neoliberalism to deal with a crisis. So you have a crisis, here's the solution, let's make things worse. And because the problem under austerity is government debt is too high. So the solution is to reduce government debt. But that simply reduces aggregate demand and makes the crisis worse. So you have these things fighting against each other. I mean, in the US, we've had some of both. We did have a big stimulus. I mean, people can argue that it wasn't big enough, but relative, as a peacetime economic stimulus, it's unprecedented in history. So we had a massive stimulus, and then we've also had austerity at the same time in terms of government cuts very quickly subsequent. So I'd say you've had both things, and austerity is certainly dominant in Europe, but hopefully with development, political development such as Podemos, we'll be able to reverse that. Well, I mean, if you start with, if we're going to function within capitalism, to have it be humane capitalism, you have to have a full employment economy. And so that you have to have institutions and policies targeted at achieving full employment. Now, under neoliberalism, you kind of got rid of that through this notion that starts with Milton Friedman called the natural rate of unemployment. And that basically the natural rate of unemployment is saying that unemployment is a microeconomic problem. If there's unemployment, it means the wages are too high. Otherwise, a business would hire a worker in order to achieve profit. So that if wages are too high, then the answer is lower the wage, and if there's a problem lowering the wage, that's because there's institutional rigidities. That's because there's a social welfare state. That's because there's minimum wages. So the agenda of neoliberalism has been to chop those things down. Now, the other way to say those things are things that make life livable for the working class and for the people who are poor. So you're going from a social democratic variant of capitalism that has some concern for the well-being of the ordinary people to one that isn't. Okay, so that's number one, that the natural rate of unemployment theory, which has been demonstrated to be wrong, because we've had wage cutting, we've had austerity. In the United States, an average worker is making about 10% less than they were 40 years ago, when productivity is up 135%. So we have that. It doesn't work. Regulation. So certainly the notion that financial markets are self-regulating, which comes out of neoliberalism, has no historical support. I mean, if you study the history of financial markets and the very important work of Kindleberger, Manias, Panics, and Crashes, demonstrates irrefutably that capitalism, financial markets generate crises, always have. The only time that they have been more mild is when we had a financial regulatory system. So you need to have a macro framework focused on full employment, a social welfare state, and a system of financial regulations. And heterodox economics is basically built around understanding how to make those things happen. It's certainly imperfect. There's a lot of areas of gaps in knowledge. Orthodox economics is not asking those questions. Orthodox economics is saying, we understand that essentially unregulated capitalism works best and there's no alternative. If you take climate science seriously, we have to make dramatic cuts in greenhouse gas emissions, in particular CO2 emissions, dramatic cuts within the next 20 years, 30 years, and we have to start right now. Otherwise, if you take climate science seriously, we're staring in the face of an ecological catastrophe. It doesn't mean it will happen, but the probability is sufficiently high that we have to take this warning very seriously. Now, that means you have to do things quickly, and that means you have to mobilize our tools that we have in economics. It is an economic problem. It's not just a problem of climate science, it's an economic problem. So that we have to mobilize public investment and private investment. Keynesian economics is basically an investment model, understanding what it takes to get investment levels up and to sustain them. My framework for understanding the green economy, it is an investment model focused on green investments. And so I try to understand what are the incentives necessary to generate very substantial increases in renewable energy investments and energy efficiency investments. So the tools are pretty straightforward. And some of them are, it's public spending, and it's public investment banks, it's subsidies, and so in terms of this simple market failure model, that orthodox economists that believe in climate science say that, well, we do have to raise the price of fossil fuels. And I agree with that. So that's part of the model, but that alone is not going to mobilize sufficient investment quickly enough. The good part about the green economy, like any other investment, is it will also create jobs and create multiplier effects. So, you know, Keynes said, you know, to stimulate the economy, let's hire people to dig holes in the ground, bury money, and then dig up more holes to take the money out. So what I'm saying is hire people to do the work, but let's do something productive with it. Like, let's save the earth. How about that? And so that's really the framework in which I think we have to move on a green agenda.